Today we're talking democracy, the future of democracy. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, the site based in London in the UK. And I'm delighted I'm joined by Jan-Werner Müller, author of new book out in the UK now and in the US, Democracy Rules. And you're the professor of politics at Princeton University and published, of course, famously, What is Populism in 2016, before Brexit happened and before Trump, which was your look at the movement which was determining the direction of politics. And so the new book, Democracy Rules. Just to get into it, to begin with, the big theme: are you hopeful, optimistic, depressed about the condition of democracy? There is a lot of anxiety in the West at the moment with a democracy. How do you see it?
So let me say two things. I'm hopeful, but not optimistic, by which I mean that, yes, there is hope because there are certainly many paths still open to not just, as it's sometimes put, save democracy, but in certain ways to deepen democracy, extend democracy in all kinds of ways. So it's a distinct possibility, but optimism, in a sense, is an estimation of probabilities. And there I'd be much more cautious in terms of saying, oh yeah, sure, it's going to sort of work itself out. Having said that, second remark, if I may, of course, as you know, there's been a kind of inflationary sort of discourse around crisis of democracy in the last couple of years, with 10 books per week coming out talking about crisis. And with all due respect, I think one problem with that sort of deluge is that very often it's unclear what people really mean by crisis, because a policy challenge is not in and of itself a crisis for democracy. People being dissatisfied is not in and of itself a crisis for democracy, can in fact mean the opposite. People see the shortcomings, that's why they're dissatisfied. So I think we should generally be somewhat more precise about what we really mean by crisis, which, if you go back to the original meaning of the word, is something like a real life and death moment. And not everything that people nowadays label as crisis really fits into that category.
And why do you think there has been this, as you described it there, as a sort of inflationary moment in terms of the language of politics, how we talk about democratic crisis? And you're in the book, you make it very clear, just because people are concerned doesn't mean that it's a rerun automatically of the 1930s, or that fascism is automatically around the corner. Why has this happened? This period from 2010 to now, and it's still going, even despite the election of Biden, and Trump, of course, may even be the next president of the United States. What's behind it? Is it technology, anxiety? What's driving the fear?
So the fear is entirely justified. There is now what I would call a right-wing populist, if you like, also authoritarian art of governance, which we've seen in a whole range of countries. Orban in Hungary was a kind of pioneer of this, but think of Erdogan, think of Modi, think of Maduro in Venezuela, think of Trump when he was in power. Very similar patterns in terms of what these actors do, how they try to hijack the state, how they try to intimidate independent media organizations, how they try to capture courts. So these are real reasons for concern. But having said that, with all due respect, the question, what is driving it all, is also somewhat of a problem in and of itself, that especially sort of liberals in the widest sense of that term, on the one hand sort of tend to say, look, we are the people who do complexity, and the populists are the ones who have, simplistic solutions to complex problems. But if anybody can tell us, the macro reason for everything in ideally 140 characters, but please no more than 280, and then we also are very ready to buy this. And my maybe pedantic point is that even though there are similarities when you look at these outcomes and these patterns of governance, that in and of itself doesn't prove that the cause is everywhere the same. And again, very pedantic maybe, but we still need to look very closely at individual nation states, what happened within them, because the reasons for the rise of these characters are not identical. And, we all would love it if somebody could simply tell us, oh, it's all economic or it's all cultural, which of course, often enough, is a euphemism for race or something else. But my maybe overly academic point is that no, we still need to look very carefully. And the fact that we see the similarities in outcome is more due to the fact that these characters can basically learn from each other and copy each other. So if somebody comes up with, a facially neutral law that de facto serves to intimidate independent media organizations or civil society, others can take note and they can adopt similar tactics. Or, concrete example, Bolsonaro is basically already leaning towards creating a kind of situation as Trump did in 2020. So should Bolsonaro lose the election next year, he's already ready with arguments along the lines of course, it was fraud. Of course, it can't really be true that people didn't really want to re-elect me, and so on. So it's a very relatively banal example, but just to underline the point that there's a lot of transnational learning going on. And I think sometimes people are still underestimating that precisely because populists are not just sort of simplistic or demagogues or anything of that sort, how savvy some of these actors have become.
Yes, it's interesting. In the book, you talk about the importance in a democracy of losing, and how functioning democracies, healthy democracies, need losers, which I suppose is that it's the consent of the loser, isn't it? That what you've just described there with Trump and Bolsonaro is one of the central assumptions for the system to work effectively, is that there's an acknowledgement sometimes your side loses, that and if your side is unlucky or on the wrong side of some sort of economic disaster briefly, or just tired and out of ideas, then your side might be out of power for a while. It's a very powerful shift, that though, isn't it? The idea that your side can't lose, it must always be a stitch up by the other side.
Yeah, so I'm not claiming that this is some incredible philosophical discovery, that if you get fewer votes, you should recognize the fact that you've lost. I mean, that's not really news. And especially in the UK, the idea of a legitimate opposition is also not exactly, something that was invented yesterday. But I think what we're seeing more today, not always, but quite often, is that specifically populist politicians or parties whose core claim, in my view, is that they and only they represent what they often call the real people. So not all citizens are the people, only some are the real people, or also typically called the silent majority. That when these sorts of actors lose, they have a kind of problem that other politicians don't have, because they somehow need to make sense of a situation where, according to themselves, they are the only truly legitimate representatives of the people, or at least the majority. So it can't really be the case that they lose at the ballot box. So it's not an accident that often, again, I'm not saying always, but very often, populist losers essentially do something like the following. They suggest that, if the majority could truly express itself, they, of course, would have won. They would always already be in power. So the fact that they didn't seem to win can only be a sign of the fact that we're not so much talking about a silent majority, but about a silenced majority. In other words, there's a very quick suggestion that somebody, guess who, maybe liberal elites, behind the scenes must have manipulated things such that the people's only true champions didn't win. So very often, even if they ultimately concede defeat, they at the very least sort of sow doubt about our institutions. They kind of question the election system, which I hasten to add, in general, is of course completely okay. I mean, I'm not saying that we're not allowed to criticize, our electoral systems. I mean, especially, but not only in the US, there's plenty to criticize. But there's a difference between somebody who says, look, I think our campaign finance regulations are awful. I think that our party systems are regulated the wrong way, or whatever it might be. These sorts of abstract claims are very different from somebody who ultimately stands there and says, because I didn't win, our system is rotten. That's not a democratic claim.
Is there a problem on the flip side, though, and you use the term liberal elite. Yeah, I don't particularly like the term either, but let's use a sort of catch-all term for a globalized, theoretically highly educated class that's quite often used to winning in politics, used to winning in politics, and used to winning in finance and in life. Hasn't something else played out? And not seeking to be narrowly British about this, but if you look in the aftermath of the referendum in the UK, there was a sort of reverse populist response from the losing side that was defeated, that needed an explanation beyond its own failure to win the arguments and to win a referendum, which should have been winnable for the establishment parties and the central banks, the bulk of the large companies in the country, and huge numbers of citizens, but still managed to lose. Therefore, the explanation must be that something untoward went on, that their ideas couldn't possibly have been defeated.
That's a good, i.e. difficult question. So I agree that there's a problem with a kind of symmetrical response to populism. So where people end up saying, because you are, at least in my interpretation, you are basically engaging in certain forms of exclusion, in the name of the real people or the silent majority. Therefore, we are now going to exclude you in turn. I mean, I think anybody who does that, I think, is not doing it quite right. At the same time, that doesn't mean that everything has to be accepted at face value. I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, look, I think there were irregularities in how the various campaigns were financed and run. And just because I lost doesn't mean that I have to change my substantive beliefs. It doesn't mean that, I now simply, because the people allegedly have spoken, therefore, I must say that, they've spoken the truth and I was simply wrong. I mean, we don't sort of in retrospect after an election say, whoever lost was lying or was necessarily completely wrong with their arguments. So I think it's on one level, as I was trying to say earlier, on one level, this idea that losers have to recognize that is very banal. It's really not new. At the same time, when you get into the details, one realizes that it can be a very tricky, difficult thing in certain ways, and that how you really react, what you end up saying after a loss, can be very telling as to how you really conceive your role in a democracy. And maybe less obviously, it also has a lot to do with sort of what kind of institutions ultimately have to say we lost and we recognize that and so on. I'm only bringing that up because one of the things that I think has also gone wrong in a number of countries is that what used to be fairly traditional political parties, which is to say parties with real structures, with long-term programs and so on, they can find it easier to lose because they say, look, we're going to continue, we're going to have another chance, and we have long-term goals, and at the next election, we're going to convince more people that our side is right. If, like Trump, you turn a party into a kind of personality cult, where basically no critical loyalty or legitimate opposition or any open discussion really inside the party is allowed, where the party also has no real program anymore. Remember how in summer 2020 at the convention, Republicans basically refused to formulate a new program. They simply pledged loyalty to Trump and said, we will do whatever he tells us to do. I mean, that's not really a political party. That's sort of a personal club in support of the great leader. But conversely, then, if the great leader, with all due respect and no ageism implied, is in his mid-70s and doesn't have very long time horizons and takes everything personally, that provokes, I think, a very different reaction to a loss than from a party that can say, look, we made some mistakes, but we're going to have another go at it. And we still think that we're right and the other side is wrong, but we're going to defeat the other lot the next time around. That sort of long time horizon, disappears if you basically have a personality cult.
I suppose what's problematic in UK terms with the referendum model, and Britain has had, it's not true that the 2016 referendum was the first referendum. We've actually had quite a few, including in 1975 confirming British membership of what became the EU. I suppose with referendums, though, in one sense, there's more at stake because you're taking a transformative long-term decision that if it goes against your side, you might not get another go for 20 or 30 years. It might permanently alter the political dynamics. What's really worrying about what's happened to the Republicans and what Trump has done is that he's destabilized one of the key assumptions about American politics, which is just that it's permanent. The electoral cycle is so short. The moment you've won the presidency, you have to start worrying about the midterms and political control unless you want to be a lame duck. So the whole cycle works in a regenerative, ideally, when it works, in a regenerative way, in which you always have another go just around the corner. And at stake is, I suppose, Supreme Court appointments have a longer term significance in the system, but the system is quick, and you get another go quickly. What do you, on the infrastructure of democracy, I wanted to ask you about the press and media and the role of technology in this. What would you define as the correct or the healthy infrastructure needed for a functioning democracy?
If I may, let me just say one word about the earlier remark you made, because I think it's very important to discuss also the kind of, if you like, time horizons or temporality of democracy. I agree that, you know, when this was instituted, sort of 2-year terms for congressmen made a certain sense and was justified in terms of, you know, they should be close to the people, they shouldn't become, you know, as the cliche would have it, a distant elite and so on. But of course, by now, as we all know, this has simply meant that people are fundraising day and night, that it's very difficult to take long-term decisions of a certain kind. And if you add to that what I would identify as sort of another fateful sort of technique of populists, which is to basically always raise the stakes and say that, look, you know, this is, I mean, sort of Flight 1993 sort of logic of saying, you know, this is the old decisive elections, because, I mean, de facto what they suggest to people is, if we lose this one, then our real, i.e. white Christian America, will be taken away from us, will be destroyed, and so on. That is going to lead to a different kind of politics than one where, yes, of course, all decisions are on one level irreversible. I mean, even if you come back to power, it's not going to be quite the same. But still, that's a different kind of politics with a sort of inbuilt fallibility than one where you basically also make people, and we sort of know this empirically now pretty well, where you basically put people in a position where they say, look, I don't actually necessarily like all these characters. I sort of know that the Trumps, the Orbans, etc., are not really perfect Democrats. They are doing things which I'm uncomfortable with, but because so much is at stake, our side can't lose, and it's us against them. And I'd rather stick with these leaders now, because so much is at stake, than to basically put democracy first and try to protect institutions, norms, etc., etc. So that, again, is something that has become clearer in the last couple of years, that this can be unfortunately, a very successful strategy. Anyway, just to answer the question you really posed to me now. So what I was trying to suggest with this term infrastructure, which of course has become very fashionable in all kinds of countries, you know, nobody's against infrastructure, we should repair it, have more of it, etc., was simply to say that just as much as at least a certain type of infrastructure is really about reaching people and being reached by them. So transportation, post office, this is all on one level about certain forms of communication, connection, etc. I thought it was important to re-emphasize, again, not really a terribly new point, that we all have our basic democratic, if you like, communicative rights, so speech, association, assembly, and so on. But to really use them and have an effect, to kind of multiply their power, if you like, we do need institutions. You know, I can demonstrate all by myself. I can you know, spam you with you know, my op-eds, which nobody else wants to publish, and so on. But if I have a party, which again, as an institutionalized entity, is a different matter than me just sort of spontaneously doing something on my own, or if I have, you know, what is sometimes derided as traditional news organizations, which may pick up, you know, some of the communications that citizens want to engage in, that sort of multiplies the message and gives, maybe less obviously, gives democracy a certain kind of structure or pattern that people sort of know what's what and who's saying what and what our conflicts are really about. And that remains, I think, very, very important. And that can be undermined, again, by populist leaders. It can be, to some degree, threatened by technological developments, although maybe we'll talk about this later in more detail. Although at least I don't share this sort of technological determinism that some of my colleagues now exhibit, where they say, oh, Facebook equals fascism, you know, social media are bound to destroy democracy. I don't have that view, but to kind of come to some you know, more prudent assessment of what's actually happening, I think we need to be sort of clear on the basics first and be clear on what we really expect from media organizations, from political parties, and so on.
Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, the infrastructure, you mentioned transportation, and we were talking about the word infrastructure there. In a different context, it just occurs to me, I'm fascinated by America, but one of the things I find most interesting about it, it has all of these strengths in the way in which power is dispersed and localized and state level. And it just always baffles me as a European and as a Brit visiting in the days before in the days when that was still possible, the poor state of infrastructure. But I mean, physical infrastructure, I mean, roads, subway systems, airports. But actually, I wonder whether it was only possible for America because of its attitude to localism, state power, central government power. I wonder if it was only possible to do it effectively in a really organized way about something which was essentially other, which was space. Because it was part, there you could say it's part of a national mission. It's a common thing in France or Germany, and to an extent Britain as well. Big projects which are transport related are sold as, this is about the future of the country. You live in this country, you obviously want lots of us to be able to get around it efficiently. You want to be able to visit your family efficiently. You want it to look nice. It's going to cost a lot of money. This is a national project. America doesn't work like that.
So let me say two things. One is that it wasn't always so. So, people know that nowadays, the post office in the US is in a very bad state. But in the 19th century, the post office was the pride of the country and actually contributed enormously to the development of a very vigorous public sphere because, basically newspapers were de facto subsidized because it was very cheap to mail them. It was very efficient. It was delivered, even on weekends, if I recall correctly. If you look at post office buildings in the US, I mean, you could see that there were signs of a certain kind of civic pride. So, I mean, you might say it's very telling that nowadays, of course, the old post office in Washington, D.C., very impressive building, happens to be the Trump International Hotel. And that, I think, in certain ways is the story, that it was privatization. It was the retreat of, forgive me for putting it so crudely, but I think that's essentially the story, of certain wealthy segments of society into a sort of privatized sphere / gated community where they say, look, we don't need some of that common infrastructure. And again, things like the interstate highway system built under Eisenhower, big, very ambitious project, really is in disrepair. One other thing, if I may, because it might be of interest to your viewers, which I think many of us are also struggling with in this country, but I think also elsewhere. So one of the interesting conclusions, I think, from the Trump years was that when the chips are down, when it's really down to, okay, is something going to go very, very seriously wrong, or might the danger still be contained? I think one of the interesting lessons was that when, for instance, in early 2017, he had Congress, he could ignore media organizations for the most part. Millions of people could march against the so-called Muslim travel ban. Didn't really matter. But when individual states said, we're not going to implement something, so if California says, look, we're just not doing it, all of a sudden you realized, wow, it's very important. And it was, I think, also an important insight for the American left, which wasn't always enamored with federalism, because federalism, of course, was seen as the shield that protected racist practices in the South from interventions by the federal government. All of a sudden you realize, well, this point about decentralization, it might have a deeper democratic meaning. And I mean, for me, that was also partly interesting because, as you know, so the German Constitution, Basic Law, has an article which says, okay, certain things cannot be amended, no matter how big your majority happens to be. You can't get rid of democracy, you can't get rid of fundamental rights, and you can't get rid of the federal states. And some of us, maybe naively, sometimes thought, wait a minute, I mean, that's not at the same level. If tomorrow, with all due respect, Bavaria disappears as a kind of independent entity, maybe less folklore, but I mean, really, is that so essential for democracy? And then you realize, well, maybe that is actually something we've kind of neglected, that highly centralized countries, Hungary is an example, in terms of one that has gone over to more or less strong forms of authoritarianism, in a certain way are more vulnerable. But the trouble with that conclusion is that at the same time, it's sort of not obvious where exactly on the spectrum of centralization or decentralization you want to end up. On the one hand, it's a very plausible thing to say in the US, look, we have this very chaotic system. Plus, do you really want to be at the mercy of some guy in Michigan who may or may not certify something? Or do you want to leave the fate of democracy to Brad Raffensperger in Georgia? He decides this way or that way. That's not a good position to be in. At the same time, if you were to centralize everything and, create a nice, rational, bipartisan commission full of, wise, elderly ladies and gentlemen, you, of course, at the same time might create a certain vulnerability. So I don't have a solution to this, but I think it's something that maybe some of us should think more about in terms of, how do we get this right in terms of making democracies less vulnerable and at the same time not creating new vulnerabilities in the process.
I mean, the other lesson that I took from the pandemic, reading Michael Lewis's book on the pandemic, which is presented as and reviewed as an indictment of the American system. Actually, I read it the other way around, in that it reminded me just how disputatious the place is and how actually the center failed in many in many regards, but actually individual states, prompted by small bands of scientists and public health workers and officials, they did organize without the president really being involved, and sort of went round the CDC and improvised and innovated in a way which wouldn't have been possible in a highly centralized state where all authority, rested with the president. Can I just ask on the question of the press and journalism? I mean, the strong, more than implication is that journalists are sort of failing on this in this regard and need to do their effectively need to do their job better. What do you think of the state of contemporary reporting, the role it plays in what journalists, we like to tell ourselves, are a central component of a healthy democracy, and we think we have social obligations and a right to exist, but you think there's something wrong with contemporary journalism?
Well, you'll be happy to hear that I think journalism remains incredibly important, and I think we should be, again, at the risk of sounding very pedantic, maybe be more careful in distinguishing particular problems, and again, sort of refrain or resist the temptation to say, oh, there's one sort of macro cause, technology, or oh, people all have become irrational and spread lies on social media and so on. So I would distinguish journalism as a practice, which we don't need to sort of completely reinvent, but maybe at least in some countries, again, sort of authoritarian populists have shown that you can sort of weaponize what under more normal democratic circumstances would be perfectly acceptable things, but that can be turned against basically the tasks which journalists would ideally fulfill. What do I mean with these abstractions? Well, again, from the Trump years, I think we could learn that many journalists had initially great trouble with a situation where what they took to be norms of objectivity, neutrality, and so on, no longer functioned in a situation where, unlike with the old-style two-party system, you now had one of, for lack of a better term, asymmetrical polarization. So one party moves not just towards more radical policy positions, which is fine in and of itself, but basically starts to do things which in certain ways start to undermine democracy itself. And I mean, many people have said this by now, but the initial tendency to sort of stick with the both sides framework, and as late as September 2020, we had reports that said, oh, the two parties now seem to live in different realities. Well, with all due respect, maybe one reality was somewhat closer to the reality than the other one. And I think then the sort of other extreme came into play when then sometimes journalists said, oh, now, okay, I understand that something is at stake. Democracy might be threatened. So let's be the resistance, which I also think is a mistake, because Trump and Stephen Bannon exactly wanted the media to sort of reveal itself as the opposition, because then you can basically discredit journalists in advance and say, oh, look, they're always criticizing us, but of course they would, because they are the opposition and they're totally partisan. So I think what this means concretely, and I know this even when I say concretely, it's still fairly abstract, is that journalists, in a sense, also sometimes like politicians, have to find the kind of red line between normal political disagreement, where you can say, look, Democrats want this kind of healthcare policy and Republicans want that. And here are the arguments, and now, think about what you think. That's sort of, the normal kind of two sides world. But when democracy itself is at stake, I think it is important to say, well, look, now it's something different. And partly because we as journalists depend on democratic foundations, free speech and so on, and free press, we need to tell you that, something abnormal, if you like, is going on. Obviously, that can be incredibly difficult. I realize that's not a science, that's an art that basically on a certain level requires journalists to become democratic theorists and sort of, find the right line. But I think that would be one important lesson. Secondly, Trump, I think, also tried sometimes, alas, successfully, to kind of destroy the press as an institution. So not individual journalists and what they do, but the press corps as a diverse, but still on one level unified entity, when he basically started to divide people and create situations where he would, of course, refuse to engage with certain people and, deride others. And then I think it was a sort of failure that there wasn't more kind of intra-press solidarity, where you say, look, you're more left-wing, we're more right-wing, that's not a problem. But if we are being attacked in our sort of overall ethos as a body that, on one level is trying to get the facts and so on, we need to defend ourselves, not just individually, but as an institution. And lastly, and probably most obviously, because of structural changes, of course, financially, many news organizations are under incredible pressure. The book contains a couple of ideas of what to do about that, how to sort of finance proper journalism in a new way. All your viewers will know some of the models out there, the membership model, maybe the paywall model, all kinds of things one can think about. That structural challenge is real, of course, but I think it's still worth kind of keeping that apart from sort of more immediate failures, such as not realizing that portraying an asymmetrical political reality in a symmetrical fashion is a distortion. And that has nothing to do with social media or lack of funds for local journalism or anything like that. That's something that journalists themselves can still decide this way or that way.
What do you do, though, in a world of social media where, the financial pressures, we all understand them. It's why so many local and regional and city newspapers are closed in the US, and same phenomenon is observable in the UK and across Europe. So this is a Western phenomenon. So the finances of the industry have shrunk, but also simultaneously, the old readerships are on social media or dipping in and out of social media. And the main currency is shock or creating controversy and noise to try and get attention and get clicks, even if it is to then advertise a more considered product. The whole social media thing, it's like a sort of much bigger version of what we used to do. And I started in newspapers, and I still write for the Times in London. So the value of not shocking headlines, but just punchy headlines. Social media takes that and requires you to do times 100 to get noticed, which doesn't lend itself necessarily to healthy journalism.
I agree, and I disagree at the same time. So yes, we can all think of examples of pathologies of social media. At the same time, we can also think of examples of people having a voice who didn't have a voice before, people getting a following.
Yeah.
One example is a hitherto completely unknown teenager from Florida, one of the survivors of the Parkland school massacre, all of a sudden can get more followers than the almighty NRA. Of course, that doesn't change, gun laws automatically by itself. But the fact that you can sort of have new people enter the public sphere in a way that was much more difficult in the past, I think needs to be seen on the plus side. And without idealizing it, but the fact that you can now have sort of niche commentary, reporting, that all of a sudden isn't so niche anymore. I feel very ambivalent about the whole Substack phenomenon, but the fact that you can have more sort of specialized commentary, competent people commenting on, I don't know, European law or whatever obscure thing one might occasionally be interested in, and that one wouldn't have been able to really sort of get something by way of informed but not super difficult commentary in the old days, I think is all sort of on the plus side. Again, forgive this very pedantic comment, but I think one important thing that's worth bearing in mind is that we still, in a sense, know far too little about both the effects of social media and what really happens on the internet in general, partly because, of course, the relevant platform companies are so good at protecting themselves so that no social scientists really have access to the relevant data. You can sometimes sort of get a sense of how things really work, but there's a lot that, you know, initially sounded like very plausible diagnoses. So echo chambers, right? Everybody said, yeah, the problem with social media, echo chambers, filter bubbles, and so on. By now, from what I understand from some of my colleagues at least, is that ironically, there was a bit of an echo chamber about echo chambers. So we all sort of told ourselves the story, and everybody said, yeah, of course, you know, everybody on the internet just confirms what they already believed. Now it seems that, at least among a number of social scientists, the view is that actually our online lives are probably somewhat more diverse than our offline lives. And when you think about it, that's actually also kind of commonsensical, because you can see a lot of stuff online that you probably wouldn't sort of, you know, come across in quote unquote, I mean, it's not really real life, everything is real, but you wouldn't sort of see in ordinary encounters or at your dinner parties and so on. So I know this isn't a very helpful point in the overall scheme of things, but again, the sort of desire to, you know, immediately say, oh, this is definitely a bad development, just seems to be the flip side from the naivete that we had 10 years ago when, you know, some of us are old enough to remember, you know, it was said that, oh, you know, Facebook will now cause democratic revolutions everywhere. The revolution will be tweeted with the Arab Spring and so on. Now we're sort of gone to the other extreme, and probably both extremes are ultimately wrong. And again, I think we should be clearer about how things actually work empirically. We can only be clearer if, you know, these almighty companies allow us more access. And if we get a little bit clearer about what we actually want from social media to begin with, you know, what does matter for democracy when it comes to the functions of these kinds of institutions?
I mean, you're right. It's complicated, isn't it? It's the downside in the pandemic. We're aware of the way in which misinformation or disinformation has spread. However, you balance that with the access that millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of us now have to epidemiologists, experts in their field. And if you are on Twitter or on social media, I think a lot of people actually do know how to filter out the nonsense, and it is then challenged. And as you say, there's the voice, the unusual voice, the expert who really knows what they're talking about, who can get a following. I suppose the flaw in the model from a journalistic point of view is, and I should explain for those who don't know what Substack is, it's the unbundling of journalism. So it's the completion of the process whereby you don't need a big newspaper, you pay an individual for their Substack, for their email and their views, and you enter their world on the basis that someone can make a living by selling 1,000 subs to, or 500 or 1,000 subs to Substack. You know, nice idea. I think what's lost is that the unbundling itself reveals what was so good about the old news bundle, and continues to be with certain big name products, which is, so the idea was you had lots of people in their field, lots of expertise across news, business, sport, features, books, you name it. The world, whether that was the world from the perspective of someone in Houston, Texas, and local paper there, or in Boston, or the Times in England, or the Telegraph, was explained to you, and it was all there. You didn't read it all, but you dipped into your favorite parts of it, and then by serendipity, you might then stumble across something that you wouldn't ordinarily read, say a sport report or a reader's letter or an obituary or something. So the world was there in all of its richness, and it was curated for you. And I still think it's a fantastic model. One of the best things about it, though, which I think we should understand in terms of the architecture of news, which is very relevant to your book, is the power of local reporting, or what's been lost in local reporting. Now, I can't really speak for the US, but I can see a lot of newspapers have shut. But in the UK, the whole ecosystem of, for example, court reporting and coverage of local town councils in a really, the drudgery of reporting that day in, day out, imperfect, doesn't always spot wrongdoing, but just, I mean, courts in this country, there are still brilliant court reporters, but it's nothing like it was 20, 30 years ago. Those court reports then fed up through local newspapers and then via news agencies into the big national newspapers. And it was possible for a story in a court in Bristol, or a local authority, or a Quango or something, to filter its way up to the top and become big national news and then get picked up by TV. That's not, I mean, it's not gone entirely, but this process has wrecked that. And I'm unclear what the democratic impact is yet. I've sort of grappled with it a lot. I'm not sure. I think, as you say, maybe it will take investigation by social scientists in the next 20 years or so to try and figure it out. But something has happened.
Well, there actually, I think we do have fairly reliable findings. At least in the US, it seems pretty clear that the decline of local newspapers, or sometimes the complete disappearance. I mean, there are now millions of people who have no local news whatsoever. I mean, professional local news. Is pretty strongly associated with a rise in corruption. Nobody pays close attention towards deciding councils, a general decline in the quality of democratic life, so fewer candidates, also not much attention to one's representative in state assembly, in Congress, and so on. So that's, I think, actually pretty clear that this has bad results. And then if you add to that situations where national politics don't look all that great, so as in the US, one side doing a relentless culture war, then a sort of further downside is that the sort of vacuum that appears because of the absence of reliable local news is filled with basically national topics, which can then further increase asymmetrical polarization. And I mean, I don't want to be sort of kitschy communitarian about, if local people get together and talk about their problems, everybody is super pragmatic. I mean, everybody who's ever argued with a neighbor knows that this isn't always the reality. But in general, it's true that, if you have sort of localizable issues, be it as banal as, what should we do about sewage problems and so on, people will just talk differently than, people saying, our country is being taken away from us by, evil liberals or whatever it might be. If I may, let me just say one quick thing about social media still, because it might be of interest to your viewers. I think one other thing that maybe is worth emphasizing is that at least some of the pathologies we see, where there's no doubt that something is going terribly wrong. I mean, how can people, start saying things like, there's a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., and in the basement there is a pedophilia, thing going on among Democrats. It's pretty clear that at least in the US, and again, this is a fairly robust finding. This is not just, random opinion. It's a fairly robust finding that this sort of self-enclosed right-wing media ecosphere, where basically it's not really about factual news, it's about confirming your political identity, that the creation of that precedes social media. And has a lot more to do with regulatory decisions under Reagan in the 80s, has a lot more to do with a particular so-called news channel that I don't think I need to mention which one. It has a lot more to do with the rise of talk radio, the kind of deregulation of that also happened there in the 90s with cable and radio, and so on. In other words, yes, there are plenty of people out there, you might say, who are ready to believe all kinds of conspiracy theories, but these people don't overnight get, gazillions of followers. It still takes the Sean Hannitys of this world to sort of validate certain frames of mind, not always, by saying, yes, I'm going to confirm a particular conspiracy theory, but to kind of hint at something, Tucker Carlson basically legitimizing, the conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement, things like that, that essentially, we're going to see sort of crazy versions of all this, but it's not a freestanding phenomenon. It has a history, and the history actually precedes certain technological innovations. So on the one hand, that's bad news, because once sort of this world has taken shape, it's not like you can change it overnight. It's somewhat good news for countries where this hasn't really happened yet, and where you can say, wait a minute, we shouldn't just be completely fixated on social media. We should look at the larger picture. And as long as our public sphere more broadly is in relatively good shape, then yeah, we're still going to get some pretty bad stuff on social media too, but it's not going to be as bad as, alas, it has been in the United States.
What do you do about party systems, which refers back to what we were talking a minute ago about local news, I think, because this question puzzles me a lot, which is how do you get, and I don't just necessarily mean mass participation, though that's a good thing in politics. How do you get locally elite, for want of a better term, participation? By that I mean, and I think the same is true in the US as it was in Europe, that 100 years ago or 150 years ago, elites, as in those who've done well in business, in industry, in law, in education, saw it as their responsibility to get involved locally. So the town, now transformed, of course, potentially by deindustrialization, so all sorts of things have changed. The town kind of ran itself. And of course, there was a snobbery involved in terms of town elders, and the elite thought that it could dictate the course of things, the architecture, how the place functioned. The progressive ideal in the US, in the 1890s and early 20th century, of course, is the real, is the big manifestation of that elite approach. How do you get back to something like that, where people don't think, people of means who now convince themselves they're busier than they've ever been, so someone else can do it, that politics isn't something that's simply done to them or for them on a consumerist basis? It is them, and they should get involved.
So one thing from the 19th century is still true, and that's Oscar Wilde's famous observation that the problem with socialism is that it takes too many evenings. So the kind of sense that, look, do I really want to spend, endless hours with people who might have much more time, who are willing to sit there, and whoever is sort of the last man or woman standing or sitting is sort of going to win it. I think that structural problem hasn't entirely disappeared. And against that background, I think it's not so surprising that plenty of people say, look, I'm interested, I'm concerned, but I don't want to be involved in parties. I want to be involved in movements, NGOs, all kinds of other stuff. And that's prima facie not a bad thing, because all these other organizations, of course, matter too, and they have a voice, and they can shape agendas, hopefully in certain ways. Having said that, we're not going to go back to a 19th century world of notables, local elites kind of benevolently, in a more or less sort of patronizing way, sort of run things for everybody else. I think that world is gone. And I think all we can hope for is that at least a sufficient number of people, especially young people, sort of recognize that, yes, it can still be worth getting involved, and parties remain special on a certain level, because all these other movements, organizations, and so on are important too, can be more exciting maybe in certain ways, but ultimately it is parties who, ensure that certain people are elected to government. And there I'm not optimistic either, but I'm also not necessarily that pessimistic, because if you think about a couple of new parties or sort of movements that then fed into parties, you might not like Momentum, you might not like, Podemos in Spain and so on, but if nothing else, I think they showed that actually a surprisingly large number of people is still willing to say, yeah, I'm gonna be involved with a party of one sort or another, to the extent that especially actually young people who seem to have sort of quit the political system entirely, by which I mean they stopped voting and participating in any shape or form, kind of came back to the polls, and again, somewhat miraculously, going back to our discussion earlier, would simply accept losing and say, okay, this time, let's say Podemos lost the election, but we're not giving up. We're going to try again in 4 years or whatever it might be. And on one level, again, you might say that's very banal. You know, what else can they do? But you think back to the 1970s, and you think back to young people in a certain number of European countries, Italy, Germany, and so on, who had basically said this system is bankrupt or is so rotten that we're going to do something else and we're going to take up arms. So against that background and against that the background of that historical experience, you think, well, it's maybe not as bad as sometimes people make it out to be when they, I think, again, too carelessly invoke things like crisis of representation in our democracies.
So final question then, you're not optimistic, but you think that there's hope, and that there are ways that democracy could possibly, hopefully, find its way.
Absolutely, and that's because the practices are there, the principles are ones that people understand, and these are principles also of, I mean, broadly speaking, freedom and equality, that contrary to what we sometimes read, when I think, again, too carelessly, sort of big headline grabbing conclusions are drawn from certain surveys, it's not true that, you know, millions of people want to be done with the system or are saying, oh, authoritarian China, that's so much better, you know, let's try that for a change. That's very different from certain decades in the 20th century, when people really said, look, parliamentarism doesn't work, and this is inefficient, and it's corrupt, and it's plutocratic, and you know, there are better systems out there. That's not the case, as far as I can tell. That's not the case today. So again, that's not a guarantee of anything. Partly because those bent on undermining democracies today have also become savvier. They've become more skillful in disabling democracy, while at the same time still talking the language of democracy, and, you know, offering us sort of justifications for what they do that can sound, you know, sometimes quite reasonable. I mean, take Republicans talking about voter fraud. I mean, who doesn't want to prevent voter fraud? But you get into the details and you realize, okay, it's really about something else. So that's why I'm not, God forbid, I'm not advocating any kind of complacency along the lines of, oh, it's going to work itself out one way or the other. But all I'm saying is that some of the reasons which are sometimes advanced for being pessimistic are not terribly valid. And what's also not valid, if I may say so, is the sort of disdain occasionally exhibited by, again, in the broader sense, liberals, who say, okay, Trump, Brexit, horrible. That just goes to show that the great unwashed, you know, should ideally participate less in politics. Let's re-empower gatekeepers. Let's re-empower professionals. I think that's the wrong approach. I think that draws the wrong lessons from the last couple of years.
Jan-Werner Müller, thank you very much for joining us to talk about your new book, Democracy Rules, out now in the UK and in the US. Thank you for joining us. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction and you're watching this, it's really easy to subscribe on YouTube. Just hit the button, and also sign up on the website for a free 30-day trial where you get all of our analysis on politics, economics, and culture. Thank you for listening.